Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to Futucast. My name is Isa Kraudio, and I will be your host for this episode, as always. Pleased to be here with you, everyone. This is another English language episode. Very happy to make one of these again. There's going to be a few more of these. If you want us to make more of these in the future, do let us know. I really like making these. So unless there's a massive rebellion amongst all of you, then I'll keep doing these. Very excited for this episode. I'm here with one of my favorite, maybe my favorite political philosopher YouTuber at the moment, at least in the S tier of all political philosophy YouTubers at this time, Vlad Vexler. Welcome to Futucast.
Isaac, thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, you might be familiar to a lot of our viewers already. I would guess so. We kind of exist only as a minor speck, but we do exist in the same sphere, at least in the vicinity of it. And you're mostly focused on videos about political philosophy, focusing on Russia, Russian political philosophy, Russian politics, but also Western politics, Western political philosophy. You've talked a lot about the democratic crisis, post-truth politics. I imagine we're going to get to a lot of these topics in this episode. Let's see where it takes us. But just as an introductory question to you, you talk about the four emotions of the democratic crisis. And we're going to get to what that is, I feel. But you, Vlad, when you wake up in the morning and you realize you're a Homo sapien in the year 2024, you look at the world, you look at everything that's happening, what are some of the feelings that you feel?
I feel good. And that's strange because I talk about Western democracy being in decline, and I am a citizen of the UK, and my entire political identity is, if not UK-based, is certainly Europe-based, Central Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe. The reason I feel okay is because my basis for understanding where we are is not the recent past, but the past in general. So I recognize that we're coming out of a bubble where we had more optimism, more elbow room, more hope about the kinds of political institutions we like globalizing. And relative to that bubble that we could date 1989 till 2014, let's say, we are in a worse place, and in a place that's going to get yet worse, but how much worse depends on what we do about it. So relative to the recent past, we're in a pretty bad way. But relative to the past in general, we're not. We're moving from a very good period to a good period, and then from a good period to a not very good period, and then we might drop further down. But that's to some extent in our hands. So even if you look at the history of Western democracy, crisis is a normal state for it. And crisis does not mean that Western democracies are going to collapse. It just means that, to use my reheated analogy, we're coming out of the bay where we were really quite safe for a few years and going into open water, and it'll be choppy. And we'll be a bit freaked out if we still live in a world that's the 89 till 2014 world. But choppy waters does not mean that we're going to sink. And that's a very important understanding for me, that crisis doesn't mean collapse for Western democracy. So as somebody who thinks about politics from Thucydides through to Hobbes and Machiavelli through to us, it's not appropriate for me, it's not proportionate for me to be freaking out about our situation. But I think if all my judgment about where we are were based on that more positive bubble we're coming out of, then I would be much more into doom and gloom than I am. That's a very difficult balance to strike, because we tend to oscillate between catastrophizing and normalizing. There's a lot of people walking around who think, oh my word, it's the end of Western democracy. There are also people, in fact, I would say half of my audience, who think that nothing is substantially wrong and that the democratic degenerations we're seeing are aberrations to be fixed once Western electorates rebalance themselves a bit and stop being ignorant, misinformed, and irrational. That, I think, is a profound error. But it's also a profound error to swing to the other side and set our hair on fire 10 times over needlessly. If we need to set our hair on fire, we should, but we should do it when it's really necessary. And at this point, it's about focusing on the world as it really is and on the fact that we can still tell a truthful but hopeful story about where we are. And that's really an important value for me. How do you tell a story about what's going on that's accurate and truthful, but yet gives us hope and a modicum of optimism about the sustenance of some of the values and institutions we're most committed to?
Very, very interesting. There's a lot there to talk about. I do remember it is always good to zoom out a little bit and get perspective, get the bigger picture, and then you realize where you are in the little picture. But you couldn't blame anyone for saying that. Why should I care about Thucydides? My life is getting worse. My feeling of being represented in my society is getting worse. And even in my circle of people who generally feel hopeful as you do, I remember you stopped sounding like an idiot at the end of the last decade, maybe the beginning of this decade at latest. You stopped sounding like an idiot when saying, like, some of the fundamental things in society are actually getting worse, not better. So you do seem to be right about that. We agree with that. But what specifically do you mean when you say that? What is happening with our democratic system? Why is it in crisis right now?
I think there are certain social forces that are making the sustenance of our institutions difficult. Here are some of them. One is a kind of untethering of social bonds in our society, untethering of community bonds, untethering of intergenerational bonds, that's making it very difficult to tell a story about how we, in a single state, whatever state we might be talking about, are in this together. It's one thing. Another thing is just this, what we're doing right now, the disinhibiting and polarizing effects of social media, the current state of the internet, and our incapacity not just to think about how to make the state of the internet less destructive for our democracies, but how to even talk about making it less destructive. There is also, of course, an extraordinary degree of exclusion. People who are excluded from the political process or feel excluded from the political process. And that's very toxic, because if you feel that you are not part of this, then you're not worried about it falling apart. You might even want it to fall apart. And then there are also some ideologies, I call them psychic ideologies of self-realization. Some of them show up in a lot of our progressive politics, a lot of our progressive aspirations, and are based very much on putting front and center the identities of particular groups, rather than advocating for the rights of these groups via values that hold all of us together, like solidarity and the public good. And I see danger there too. A danger that makes us incapable to talk about what we have in common with our political opponents in our domestic polity. So, for instance, I'm sitting here in East London in the UK, and in 2016, I experienced a political defeat because I am somebody who loves Europe. I even sit here feeling that I am in Europe, in the sense that I feel that Berlin and Paris are cities in my country. It's a big country. It stretches from, the central and eastern parts of Europe to the east coast of the United States. So I have a terribly European political identity, but I lost a vote about Britain staying or exiting from the European Union. But the people who I lost it to, who voted Brexit in the UK, are my fellow citizens. And I share a bond with them, and I even share some responsibility for this outcome, which I reject. Plus, of course, I accept for all its faults, the process that generated this outcome. So that bond, even though I lost in this significant political dispute in my country, doesn't evaporate. I am still in a joint political enterprise of cooperation and constructive conflict with my fellow citizens. But I think that we're at risk of losing various respects in which we are still in this together, even though we're opponents. Opponents aren't enemies. The politics of enemies is toxic to democracy. Opponents today could be allies tomorrow on a different issue. And one of the reasons that it's so fascinating to look at extremities in our world, like the Putin regime, is that they manifest an extreme case of a politics of enemies. I mean, if you look at the Putin regime, one thing that you won't find there is any recognition of the very concept of political opposition. Putin would just think that if you're not with him, you're either a traitor or an enemy. Political opposition is a sort of democratic siren song Westerners talk to themselves about, but it has no political reality. And the trouble is that we have that here too, just on a much lower level. And that's just an illustration of the fact that looking at extreme societies can teach us something about us, because they contain intensified versions of problems that we also find here at home.
Yes. One way to describe what's going on right now, I forget who I heard this from. I'm sure I heard this from plenty of people who commented on this, is that if you talk about the term democracy, there's many ways in which you could talk about it, or many things that you can mean when you say the word. One could be the will of the people. Full stop. That's it. Democracy is what the will of the people is, and that's basically what it should mean. Very intuitively, I think people resonate a lot with that thought. But then when people actually start talking about democracy and what is important to them in democracy, they start evoking images and thoughts about the institutional order we have in our countries, liberal democracy, the rules-based order, sort of the scaffolding that holds everything together, kind of. Is this a good way to contrast a conflict or the crisis that's going on right now, that people seem to be talking about democracy in different ways? Some people are trying to protect this scaffolding, while other people are starting to get dissatisfied with the rules of the game.
Well, it's not just because I'm grateful to be your guest, but I think it's a brilliant way of putting it. Yes. I think that one of the conflicts we are seeing is a conflict in our democracies between a picture of democracy as majority rule and the picture of democracy as checks and balances that sustain institutions, because institutional sustenance, the sustenance of this idea of power checking power to keep our show on the road, this idea is primary, right? And you can never let majority rule break this situation of checks and balances, because if you do, we're going to effectively be at risk of losing not just our institutions, but losing everything, losing many aspects of our way of life. I think that's a very important conflict that we're going through now. So the institutional picture of democracy and the picture of democracy as majority rule. It's a normal conflict in the sense that part of democracy is conflict about what democracy is. I always like to say that there are two ways of talking about democracy. One is a very banal one, and that's to say, are some basic institutions in place, right? Do we have free universities, independent courts? Do we have elections that are up to the task of kicking a government out of power? That's got a very banal way of talking about democracy that I find important. But a richer way of talking about democracy is to think of it as a project of moving in some direction together while conflicting about what that direction is. And again, that takes us back to the very point we started with about the normality of conflict and crisis in democracy. But what we're seeing now is a very, very deep conflict about what democracy is in our democracies. And that's manifested in the fact that if you look at the United States and the big election coming up, both sides have accused each other of being an existential threat to democracy. The Harris campaign have actually largely suspended Joe Biden's central message that democracy is on the ballot, because they've tried to capture Trump, not in terms of a democratic pestilence, but in terms of a weirdo, or in terms of somebody who's devoid of joy. And that's an improvement in messaging. But the previous messaging was Trump's a threat to democracy. And Trump's messaging is that the Democrats are a threat to democracy. And the point is, it doesn't matter who is right. I can tell you who is right and you'd agree with me, and it's not Trump. But the point is, it doesn't matter who is right. It's toxic when we dispute with each other by claiming that the victory of the other side will be a case of democracy being put on the ballot and being rescued or defeated. And what we'll see in the United States, whatever the outcome of the election, is a kind of democratic crisis, a kind of constitutional crisis after the election, because neither side will fully recognize the legitimacy of the victor. That's the problem. When you lose and complain that the process is illegitimate, even when it was legitimate, what you do is you confiscate the legitimacy of the victor from the victor. The victor is left sort of bereft of the understanding that whether you support them or not, that they've got there via a process that we can all agree on.
Can I stop you there and actually ask you?
This is where we are. Go on.
Yes, it's. I don't know how else to phrase this, but like, how can it be? How can that claim be toxic if it's true? Or in what way could it be? I know you started elaborating on it, but that's a very interesting claim. I mean, obviously we don't know what's going to happen in a possible next Trump election, but I think if you challenge a Democratic campaigner about the slogan, like, oh, Trump is a threat to democracy, they would say, well, we know a lot about the elector scheme that Trump did during 2020 in the elections, and that he tried to subvert the process. Not subvert the process, kind of subvert the process. Yeah, there was a legal theory about how to subvert the democratic process, transfer of power. And if that is true, how can claiming that be toxic in a democracy?
The tradition historically that I come from as a political philosopher, and some of my work off YouTube that hasn't appeared that much in the world because I'm living with a disability and I'm slow to push things out there, is a tradition that takes very seriously the thought that speech about politics is itself a political act and itself transforms political reality. Now, my view is that Trump's a threat to democracy. I think that threat can be exaggerated, but I think he is a threat to democracy in the sense that my view is that US democracy is likely to substantially survive a second Trump term, but that a second Trump term would do enormous lasting damage to the resilience of US political institutions, with an outside chance of doing catastrophic damage to them. The trouble is that when you begin putting this truth as a central message in your campaign, you add to polarization. You disable yourself from persuading people from the other side and persuading people who are undecided, and you increase the chances of Trump winning, thereby increasing the decline of US democracy. So we are looking at an example of a truth that, while it is a truth, shouldn't be uttered as the center point of a campaign to defeat what is indeed an anti-democratic, authoritarian, populist project. So this is about political speech transforming reality. My solution isn't that you lie about this, it's that you decenter that message. Yeah, He's a threat to democracy. But as the Harris campaign have done, you can say first and foremost, well, he's weird, he's incompetent, he's going to take away some of our freedoms. And that's a better way to proceed in terms of effective politics. If you wanted to do expressive politics and just express your emotions, express your views, express your political identity, you could center Trump as a threat to democratic discourse, so finally, to democratic sustenance. So funnily enough, it's something that I can do as a non-politician. It's something that you can do as a non-politician. But if, God forbid, I were asked to be a political advisor to the Kamala Harris campaign, which is something I could never be because I don't do practical politics. The last thing I would tell them to do is to center that message, because there's going to be not much gain in it. In fact, it will just contribute to a polarization that cumulatively undermines citizen trust further. So you're absolutely right to point to this paradox, but I think that doesn't mean that the paradox can be easily dislodged.
Interesting. I want to get back to the democratic crisis. There's a thought that I have some trouble with. I was wondering if you could make some sense of this. The two different modes of thinking about the word democracy that I just presented, I have a hard time dismissing either one of them. Like, both of them make sense. I mean, of course, democracy has to be the will of the people, or has to include that, the will of the people has to be represented, it has to feel like it's represented. It's very, very important. Without that, democracy doesn't make sense. But then, of course, the most valued form of democracy that we have right now, in a very general sense, in a very broad sense, is the liberal, democratic, institutionalist order that we've now constructed. I'm a very, very staunch supporter of that as well. I think it's very important. Without that, there's nothing that binds together the will of the people. There's no trust. There's no whatever. It doesn't work. But if a lot of the democratic crisis has to do with people becoming fundamentally skeptical of this institutionalist order, I can't help but to think that that is a very, very democratic phenomenon. It is a fundamentally democratic feeling outside of it. And as someone who wants to support democracy, seeing these presumed opponents of democracy, anti-democratic populists, I have a hard time not sympathizing with that phenomenon and them as individuals as fundamentally coming from a very democratic place in their political thinking and their feelings. Does that make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense. I think that there's a very important intuition there, which is that you very rapidly descend into a kind of demophobia if you go around saying that, let us say, Trump voters are irrational, ignorant, anti-American, helpless victims of malign enterprises of foreign interference in our democracies, and that's all there is to it. So you have to start with, I think, two very important images when you think about people who seem to be engaging in the politics that undermines our institutions. One is that the actual feelings of voters matter, and you can only start with the actual feelings of voters. What do people feel on the doorstep? You can tell them that they're factually wrong about certain things, but you can't tell them that what they feel is just simply an error, because politics isn't an argument. Politics is about cooperation or conflict, hopefully constructive conflict, around collective coexistence. If you and I are having a meal together and you want to drink a Burgundy and I want to drink a Barolo, I can't just tell you that you're misinformed, that you're wrong. I could make arguments. I could say that the wine list we have in front of us is better on the Italian side and that I should win this disagreement. But ultimately, if I shove a wine you don't want to drink down your throat during our dinner, you're not going to be having a good time. And I won't be having a good time because we're still going to be having the dinner together. The only way out of this is for me to evict myself from the dinner table, evict myself from the table of politics. And I can't really do that except through secession or immigration. We're stuck with each other to a good extent. So you have to start with the actual feelings of people on the door. So that's the first image. The second image, it's very important, is that you shouldn't find yourself too often in the position of pretending you've won arguments you haven't won, right? There's a lot of political views that I happen to have about what's happening in my country, in the UK. But I need to be very sober about the fact that on many of these issues, my fellow citizens are unpersuaded. And there's a real risk if elites, or what is perceived as the political establishment, talks about issues as though they have been settled, even when majorities or large minorities in the country aren't yet on board. It doesn't matter if the issue is an issue you feel you're right on. It doesn't matter if your progressive ideology tells you that it'll be a better world if everybody was on board. The bottom line is, are the others in your society on board or not? If they're not on board, you can keep making the argument, but you shouldn't pretend that you have won the argument even when you haven't. One of the big risks for a lot of Western governments, a lot of centrist Western politics today, is to talk about issues as though we no longer need to sort of legislate on them politically, as though they have been solved, and then treat large numbers of people who are unpersuaded as though their lack of persuasion is sort of ephemeral, because they're irrational. Once they wake up, once they realize that they're irrational, their opposition to us will dissolve. And I'm seeing a lot of gaslighting of populations by centrist politics that speaks to them as though certain issues have been resolved when they haven't. And one of the great drives behind populism and anti-institutional populism is the thought, well, hey, these 4 issues are being treated like they're settled, but they're not settled. We've got millions of people who don't agree. A classic example is immigration. We've got millions of people in the UK who listen to political representatives who say, well, we can't do without X level of immigration because we just need it for the sustenance of our economy, for the sustenance of our public health service, for the sustenance of our polity. And if you don't agree with that, well, then paint some other picture of how we're going to keep this show on the road. But the point is, a lot of citizens feel, well, I'm unpersuaded by this. I don't share this perspective, even if I don't have a practical alternative of how to run our society without policies like that. And so you can keep arguing at me that I'm wrong, but don't tell me that my position is irrelevant because we sort of progressed beyond it. We haven't progressed beyond it because you haven't persuaded me. And so one of the risks, and I'm just giving this particular example of immigration policy, is to opt for an immigration policy first, and then turn to your population and try to persuade them of it. And if you don't succeed, you begin gaslighting them. The alternative approach is to keep a great moral seriousness about where people actually are. And that might mean that you're very slow to bring people into the country until you have persuaded your citizens that that's a good idea. So you persuade first, then do large-scale immigration if you've succeeded with the persuasion. If you failed with the persuasion, you have to keep doing the persuasion. I've reduced the issue to a cartoon, and of course what I'm saying is facile and absurd, but the cartoon shows a problem we've got, which is a lot of centrist politics going around treating issues as settled that are A, not settled, and B, are becoming increasingly unsettled because you've got growing minorities saying, I'm not on board. This can be very painful because folks who believe in human rights, folks who believe in liberal values of a certain kind want these issues to be settled. But the point is, wanting them to be settled and them being settled are 2 different political realities between which we have to distinguished. So these are two sort of verbose points that I've made, but they both matter. You start with emotions on the doorstep, and you don't pretend you've persuaded people when you haven't yet persuaded people, even if you believe you're right.
Very, very interesting. Two questions came to mind. I hope these are not stupid questions. I hope these questions won't urge you to like repeat everything you just said, because that was very interesting. But the first question is, do you think speaking of the wine example you presented, people are arguing about, are we gonna drink a Burgundy or a Barolo? Do we overemphasize or underemphasize facts in political discourse these days? What do you think, as far as it can be generalized? And I don't mean that, do we think the true statements in political discussions are overrated? That's not what I mean. What I mean is, in your wine example, the crux of the disagreement isn't what study shows which wine is better or more competently produced, or that is not the fundamental disagreement that people are having about what wine they want to drink. And it can't be resolved with pure factoids about the wine. Does that somehow reflect what's going on in political discussion? Do we over or underemphasize? Because on the other hand, you hear people saying one of the biggest problems in political discourse these days is how far away we are, how far away our epistemic bubbles are sort of growing apart from each other. We don't share the same facts anymore. So yeah, what do you think about this question?
I think it's another brilliant question. So, yeah, I think you're on the roll. I think that cartoonishly, here is my sensibility. We aren't robust enough insisting on glaring matters of fact, on the one hand. On the other hand, we try to pack into matters of fact things that are interpretations too much. So there's the story from, the end of the First World War, where the question was asked at the Treaty of Versailles, what will historians say about the war? And the answer came back when the question was raised, well, they won't say that Belgium invaded Germany. So we want to say that there are certain facts that we had better agree with, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a risk of us trying to pack what are interpretations, maybe correct interpretations, into the box of being facts. And I think that's a very dangerous trend in democratic discourse, and this risks getting very pedantic when you're speaking to a philosopher. But the point is,
I love it.
Facts cannot be distinguished from interpretations sharply. There are plenty of facts that are very, very flat. So let's give an example of a flat fact. 2 or more armies are engaging in combat in Eastern Europe today in 2024. That's a fact. And I think we'll get nearly universal consent here when we try to ask anybody, including Putin, as to whether that's true. Russia invaded Ukraine isn't a flat fact. It's a fact that will be sincerely rejected by the Kremlin. It won't just be propaganda. They genuinely feel they're fighting a defensive war, and they feel that we have surrounded them with a kind of a malign hybrid war of political interference in East European states. Now, I think that's wrong. And you think that's wrong, but that's what they think. And therefore, we're going to accept that Russia invaded Ukraine as a fact. I'll even go further. I'd say that it's an imperial invasion. And I even think that that's a fact. But it's not a flat fact anymore. It's a fact that requires more presuppositions. So there are narrower facts and there are richer facts. And the richest facts get very close to being interpretations. So my first point would be, when we talk about the issue of misinformation or disinformation, and we do debunking, or we do fact checking, or we look at departments of journalistic institutions that are fact checking departments, it's very important that we keep these really narrow. We keep these down to being questions about the more flat types of fact, not necessarily the flattest facts. We can get beyond two armies fighting in Eastern Europe, but we should try to keep these factual analyses, if you like, that journalistic institutions do to dealing with facts of minimal or moderate richness. Because one of the most toxic things we can do is spirit a lot of interpretation into our fact checking and then lose the power of our claim in the context of a polarized discourse in our democracy. So one of the worst things you can do is fact check somebody and be 90% right. That 10% gap is absolutely toxic in democratic discourse. When the BBC or the New York Times fact check somebody and they're 90% right, and I'm afraid I've seen that a lot, it is a democratic catastrophe. A catastrophe for our democracies. Get it 100% right and water down what you're saying. So that's one thing I would say, right? That's a thing that distinguishes narrower facts from richer facts as applied to how we do fact checking. Now, a second thing to say is that it is a sociological truth about our societies, large-scale, complex, modern societies, that they cannot any longer agree on matters of fact. It's not something that we can even aspire to. We've lost that. That is never going to happen. It is never going to come back. And so we need to be realistic about that and understand that we live in that environment and that we shouldn't pretend that we can fix it. What we should do is try to make that environment less toxic, less polarized, and do our best at realistically making the situation better, rather than pretending that our descent into alternate fact worlds, not just mental worlds that are separate, but separate fact worlds, that can be entirely fixed. It can't, because there's a real risk that in aspiring to fix it, we just revert to pretending that we live in the world in which we don't. So making our situation better is a more realistic aspiration than simply moralizing against everybody who we believe is in factual error. But I think that here we land in a very, very difficult place. The question of whether you believe that democracies survive for a very long time if they become completely untethered from the practiced virtue of truthfulness embodied in their institutions. I believe they don't. And I believe that our incapacity to share fact worlds is a structural threat to our democracies, that our institutions can contain and resist for 10 years, for 20 years, but not indefinitely. And that makes it painful, because that means that as we currently stand, we are on course for a good degree of risk of democratic collapse 10, 20 years from now in some Western democracies. So my kind of placeholder expectation is that by 2040, we lose 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 major Western democracies, and they become like Hungary. I think that is a default expectation. Now, I still think that's not a catastrophic scenario. That's most Western democracies surviving. And the 20% we can fight over. We can make it 10%. We can even aspire to make it 0. But I suppose what I'm saying is that doing our best to fix this will not guarantee a solution to this problem. It'll just make the problem smaller. I don't see a solution to this problem. It's just about making the situation a lot less bad than it is, and that we can do. But we're facing this, insoluble difficulty, that we are in a situation where we can't sustain enough truthful discourse to comfortably keep our democracies on the road. And I'm afraid that the bottom line is it doesn't work long-term sustainably to lose that access to what I call a kind of institutionally based tethering to the practiced virtue of truthfulness. So I think we're facing very difficult conflict there without a solution. But it doesn't mean that we can't always wake up and do 1% better every day of the year. So it's a pessimistic answer, but it's not a helpless answer because we can always do better.
Mm. Your answers reminded me of something you've also talked about a lot, which is post-truth politics. It's a term that's been heard in many, many other contexts as well. It's a very basic question. What do you think that is, and how is it useful for us to know what that is in order to understand what's going on right now in our democratic crisis?
At an instinctive level, we are at risk of always finding it difficult to grasp what post-truth politics is, because we tend to distinguish between politicians and political actors who lie a lot and those who don't. The problem is that systemic liars are still quite tethered to the value of truthfulness, albeit in reverse. There's a lot of politicians who lie, but they are, if you like, liar politicians in the sense that they try to make their lies relatively stable, relatively consistent, and their lies stop short of something that becomes post-truth politics, and that is that you obscure not particular truths, but the very difference between lies and truth. You try to dissolve that distinction, and that's much worse, much more toxic than lying. So if I lie, and if I say that today Isaac is located in Mongolia, that's different to a post-truth discourse, which might go something like that. A lot of people have said that Isaac is in Mongolia today. I don't know if they're right, but a lot of very good people, a lot of very reliable people have said that he is in Mongolia. I'm not saying he is there, but he could be. You never know what's true. You never know what's happening. And I'm hearing a lot of very different things. It'd be interesting to find out if that's really the case, that he is in Mongolia. Feels like he might not be, but a lot of people are saying that he is. So you see, I'm beginning to break that distinction between is he or isn't he by saying that you can't ever know. And the trouble is that it's not just Russian propaganda that puts this front and center as a piece of political technology, that Russian propaganda tries to tell us, in contrast to Soviet propaganda, just gave us a lie, basically. It gave us an alternate picture of reality. Russian propaganda, unlike Soviet propaganda, and you would have heard me rehash this endlessly, doesn't give us an alternate picture. Russian propaganda doesn't give us an alternate picture of reality. It tries to give us a picture of reality that is not particular, but is messy and confused and overwhelming, in the sense of inviting us into the thought that we can't ever know what's true. And the way it does that is by exploiting our desire not to be duped. And what's paradoxical is that a desire not to be duped very easily leads citizens into the conclusion that you can't ever know what's true. And this is quite a paradoxical psychological process, whereby you start with a thirst for truthfulness. I want to get this right. I don't want to be led astray. But you end up in a situation where you don't trust anything, including distinctions about the very difference between truth and lies. And Russian propaganda tries to achieve that by pumping into our information environment a series of contradictory messages, right? If Soviet propaganda might lie and tell us that you're in Mongolia, Russian propaganda might tell us that you are in Mongolia and you are in Vietnam and you're on the moon and you're on Jupiter and you're in Finland and nobody knows where you might be or whether you're even real. So that's a political enterprise that the Russians are engaged in, but it's also something that is a kind of organic epistemic disease, epistemic malaise, that sort of very naturally spreads in our politics, because it's a very effective tool of entrepreneurial political advancement to try to melt down the difference between truth and lies. And it is a tool that a lot of authoritarian populists in Western societies are increasingly using. And here it's very important, I think, to distinguish responsible politicians on the one hand from entrepreneurs who are just riding on the waves of moments of political moment, on the waves of public opinion for self-advancement. These are entrepreneurs. And then there are post-truth politicians who are not just exploiting political currents for self-advancement, but are in a specific way doing that via dissolving our capacity to differentiate between truth and untruth in general. And that's very, very toxic. It's self-perpetuating, and it does an enormous amount of harm because you end up with a citizenry that has no epistemic friction at all. And you started by referencing some of the ways we talk about the emotions citizens feel. And when you lose the ability to distinguish between a lie and the truth, what you feel is worse than a feeling of betrayal by your political institutions and your political elites, worse than a feeling of powerlessness. You have a feeling of opacity. And that's a word I have in part stolen from the wonderful Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And this feeling of opacity is a feeling that makes you look out onto your political institutions and see them as unintelligible, see them as making no sense, see them as a kind of a game of multiple ill-assorted sports games where all the rules are mixed up and cricket bats are mixed up with footballs. And you look at that and you say, well, that makes no sense at all. I can't say what's true or false about this. This is just a process that feels unintelligible and perhaps is a process not worth fighting for, is a process that can throw eggs and tomatoes at. So it's extremely toxic when we lose the capacity to distinguish the very difference between a truth and a lie. And that is much worse for us democratically than lying a lot to each other and having politicians who lie a lot to each other. And that's why I say, don't call post-truth politicians liars. They're not liars. They are people who melt away the very difference between truth and lies, and that's different, and it's worse.
Yeah, the opacity point reminds me of COVID, when the EU stimulus package, if it can be called that, I don't know if it can be called that, but basically the common loan that the European Union did to sort of to rescue the economy after COVID, I can understand through that theory what a lot of people felt when they looked at the media, when they looked at the numbers that said that, oh, Finland's going to be paying a lot of money into this institution and not getting as much back. We're actually getting one of the, as Trump would say, one of the worst deals in this whole thing. A lot of people have never been to Brussels. They have no idea what the European Union is on an institutional level. They can barely name their own MEPs. It's just a place somewhere, even further away than our own national government. But all I know is that I'm losing money, and that money is going into Italian balcony renovations. And I am angry, but I have no idea how that happened. I have no idea what happened in between that money leaving my pocket and going to Italy. So it's interesting. I definitely see, because there was this, I was listening to this, sorry, I'm going to ramble now for a second. I was listening to the Bridges podcast with Stephen Bennell, Destiny, and he had JJ McCullough as a guest, and Destiny presented this theory that he got as an email from someone, the magic box theory. It was very interesting. Back in the day when technology was much more simplistic, like picture an abacus, it's very easy to understand how an abacus works. You move the beads around, you could do math, very simple math. Nowadays, you have machines that most people have no idea about how they work. Might as well be magic, because I have no idea how this microphone works, no idea how this iPad works, and it leads even normal, smart people to think things and repeat things such as, oh, did you know that your phone is listening to you all the time? And then that's how it sort of presents ads to you. Like, did you know that your phone microphone is listening to you all the time? And that's how it knows how to advertise to you. It's not true at all. There's no evidence of that, but like it's an easy thing for people to believe because they don't really know how it works. They don't really know how algorithms work. I don't really know how algorithms work. Could this same metaphor be applied to politics? That opacity comes from the fact that not a lot of people know how these processes work on a fundamental day-to-day, desk-to-desk scale, and that it's an unreasonable expectation to expect that people would know how it works.
I think the answer is partly yes and partly no, in the sense that I think it's mainly working the other way around.
Oh.
It's not that the complexity of the world leads to the opacity. It's that the opacity generated by the crisis of trust leads us into an incapacity to reckon with the complexity of the world and the complexity of our institutions. So it's crisis of trust first, disinformation, misinformation, and inability to think of politics in terms of cause and effect that follows from that. But what you're describing is, of course, thinking about politics outside of cause and effect, outside of the idea that if I do X as a citizen, cast a particular vote, then these are going to be the consequences. So this particular agent is going to do that by those political means in that time frame via these agencies with potentially such consequences. So when you lose the ability to think about politics in terms of cause and effect to a radical extent, and that is what's happening to us, then of course you are in a dangerous place as a democratic citizen, and you're in a certain degree a danger to yourself, even as a democratic citizen, because you simply do not have an adequate picture of your relationship to your political institutions. And what makes this very difficult is that if I'm a citizen who has lost a capacity to engage with politics in terms of cause and effect, what tends to happen to me is that I get attracted to populist discourse that increasingly sounds like the way I would talk about politics at the kitchen dinner table. And everything that is more general sounding, more complex sounding, anything that sounds more like the bureaucratic language of a modern bureaucracy trying to talk about itself to itself and talk about itself to the population. Anything that sounds like that immediately hits me as though it were a case of elites conspiring against me. And that's a really, really difficult situation. I tend to view populism as, in the first instance, something that's to do with the nature of discourse as it relates to the gap between public conversation and private sentiment. What you've got in some societies, like the Soviet Union, is a situation where there is a push to make private discourse get absorbed by public justification and public ways of talking, right? It's a society that wanted the kitchen table to sound like state propaganda. So that's a case of public discourse trying to swallow private sentiment. It can also go the other way around, and that's where it's going in our societies in the West, whereby public discourse is increasingly drifting toward sounding like kitchen table talk. And the point isn't that it's got to be one or the other. The point is that it should be neither, that there should be a healthy distance, that the way we talk to ourselves in our democracies keeps between private discourse eating up public discourse and public discourse eating up private discourse. The trouble with citizens who have lost the capacity to think in terms of cause and effect is that they want all of their discourse to sound like kitchen table talk, and politicians are feeding into that. And the more politicians feed into that, the more they connect with citizenry. But at the same time, the more they accentuate the citizenry's incapacity to view more bureaucratic, more complex sounding language of public justification as anything other than elite conspiracy against them. And that's a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, you've got to get a bit more populist, otherwise you're going to lose the population. You're going to lose the connection with the citizenry. But if you get too populist, you are going to simply perpetuate a situation where responsible discourse that retains some of the necessary complexities and generalities just becomes inadmissible and just always sounds like elite oppression against which the population must rebel. It's an extraordinarily difficult situation, because what it asks for as a solution is a kind of responsible populism. And responsible populism is possible, but it's really like threading something through the eye of a needle. It's very, very difficult to do.
Very interesting. I have two more questions to you, and they're both about Russia, because I have to ask you about Russia, since you're such an excellent commentator on Russian politics and such like. First question has to do with Russian propaganda. You gave a really interesting, really wonderful explanation of how it works and what the contrast is between Russian and Soviet propaganda. Just on my way here, I saw an article report that Putin, or the Kremlin, has just endorsed Kamala Harris as the new U.S. president. How would you interpret that? What does that mean through the lens of what you just explained about how Russians communicate? What are your first feelings if this is breaking news to you?
Russia's view of what victory for them is, not just in Ukraine, but in their conflict with the West more generally, Russia's view of their victory, Russia's theory of victory, is Western decline. Their interference in our democracies, which is real but should not be exaggerated, it's toxic to exaggerate it to the point that we end up taking local organic conflicts as simple expressions of malign foreign interference. Shouldn't do that excessively. But their interference in our democracies is all about exaggerating, accentuating what they think is anyway a kind of ongoing, inexorable demise, partly because they think that democracy is ephemeral. It's just a sham. It's a sort of a siren song to bogus values that is not going to be sustainable for a very long time. So they have a kind of a reverse Fukuyamian view about us, as we falsely used to think that the world might converge on some kind of global civilization of democratic capitalism. So they think that democracy is ephemeral and isn't fragile and fraught and in decline, as I argue, but is in a pattern of inexorable collapse. So when they interfere in our democracies, they are trying to, in the first instance, not take sides, but add in any way they can to the ungovernability of our society. So that's the kind of the background to understanding what Putin says. My view of the 2016 interference in the US election was that the Russians didn't back Trump to win. They backed Trump as a disruptor to Hillary's campaign. They wanted a victory for a weaker Hillary. It didn't cross their mind much that Trump would win. They fell for the centrist illusion that Trump wasn't going to win. And they simply wanted to weaken US democracy by backing the most compelling disruptive candidate. My view of their position in the 2024 election remains the same, even though Putin has suggested recently that he may not mind Kamala Harris winning, as he suggested a few months ago that he may not mind Biden winning. My view of their position in 2024 is that they prefer Trump to win clearly. However, because of their feeling that our democracies are anyway in decline, they feel that whatever happens, that pattern will continue, that our democracies will keep weakening. So they see Kamala Harris as good for them. They just see Trump as even better. They have a very deterministic view of our collapse and our decline. And that is partly why Putin sits atop a situation where a part of his country is now occupied by Ukraine, while still feeling very content that he is winning the conflict and winning the war. So the only way I would qualify this is by adding that while Putin thinks that in most scenarios, Kamala Harris is much worse for him than Trump, while being tolerable, he also thinks that if there are going to be extreme scenarios, they're more likely to come from Trump. In other words, it's not just that the best case scenarios for Russia are all going to come with a Trump presidency, Putin thinks. He also thinks that some of the worst case scenarios for Russia would come from a Trump presidency too. He thinks that there is a possibility that Trump could take a stronger stance on Ukraine than the Harris-Walz administration ever could. He thinks that that's very unlikely, but he probably thinks that there's a 10% chance that that's true. So he thinks that the very worst case scenario for him could actually be a Trump scenario, but that 90% of the time, Harris is a more advantageous candidate for him. Now, a question arises, is Putin right about this? And my answer is no, probably not. Why does he think this about Trump? He thinks it about Trump because his core analysis of Trump is correct. His core analysis of Trump is that he is a populist buffoon who is bewilderingly incompetent behind closed doors while being a communicator of genius, and who got co-opted in his first term into a policy that Putin sees as tougher on Russia than Obama ever was. And as a result, Putin really believes that Trump could somehow get co-opted again. Putin recognizes that Trump will probably learn a few lessons from his co-option in his first term, and that he will try to form an elite around him more effectively. And we can talk about Project 2025 in this dimension too. But he thinks that because Trump remains wildly incompetent, unlike Orban, who Putin sees as highly competent, that something could happen to Trump that could actually put a real spike in Russia's wheel. Now, my analysis is slightly different. It's that I do see Trump as remaining incompetent at forming an elite around him. But I don't see that ending up in too many scenarios that are favorable to Putin. It's possible, but I think it's a lot less likely than Putin thinks. So I don't entirely share his view that 10 or 20% of the time he's going to end up with a worst case scenario with Trump. But what I am confident about is that Putin genuinely believes that Kamala Harris is worse for him 8 or 9 times out of 10, and that they do not just want disruption in this election. They want disruption in the form of a Trump victory. In other words, I think they really are with a clear position here, which they didn't have in 2024. So despite him seemingly somewhat endorsing Harris in his recent comments, I think that is a piece of political technology with behind it a clear position that they want a Trump victory, but not because Trump's going to be an agent for their interests. It's just because they think that Trump's going to be erratic and is going to be much more open to wanting to bring the war to a close in a destructive and unsustainable way for Ukraine, something that Putin thinks the Harris administration is going to be less ready to do.
Very interesting. It's another question how much is going to move the needle in the American election, who Putin endorses. I don't know if it matters, but it might matter a little bit. But that brings me to my final question, which has to do with how Putin affects domestic politics, at least here in Finland, but I guess Europe in general, and the West in general. It's become sort of an accepted counter argument to a lot of internal disagreements we have here in Finland. And, you know, democracy is doing pretty fine here in Finland. We're very proud of the social trust we have here, our trust in our institutions and everything. All of this democratic crisis stuff is in its baby steps here in Finland, I'd say, compared to a lot of places. And I'm very happy about that. But it still exists. Obviously, we still live in the same world. And kind of surprisingly, I feel quite uncomfortable. Even when people in my social political circle have started to use this phrase, "Pelaat Putinin pussin," you are, this opinion, the thing that you're expressing right now, this is in line with what Putin indirectly wants, or this disagreement that we have domestically about some issue, you have now taken the side that more closely resembles the side that Putin would want to happen, or something like that. And fair enough. And I also understand that a lot of people feel emancipated by the fact that now you can say that straight, you know, don't care about, like, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't care about Russian interests. We should care about our own interests. But I really also don't like how much Putin and what we think of him has started to affect domestic discussions or our conversations about domestic disagreements. I feel like that is eroding our political climate a little bit here in Finland. Instead of focusing on the matter at hand, we start to care about this authoritarian in another country and what he feels about our disagreements. Do you share that this is a bad thing? How do you think we should handle these things instead?
I think that a lot of anti-Putin people in the West and a lot of the most passionate supporters of Ukraine globally on social media are feeding Putin's propaganda machine. And let me make clear why I think that's the case. The central purpose of Russia's interference in our democracies, definitely functionally, but to a large extent at the level of intent too, isn't for the interference in our democracies to be the central harm, but for our reaction to the interference in our democracies to be the central harm. The central damaging impact, an intended impact, certainly a functional impact of Russian interference, is that the interference does some damage to us, but that over and above that, our fight and our polarization about the interference does even more damage than the interference itself. So one of the things that I'm seeing a lot in the pro-Ukraine space is that people who are pro-Ukraine in one way versus another are accusing each other of being Putin assets. That is what he wants. Now, if you look at the Russian opposition, the Putin regime literally is in an ongoing active project to make the Russian opposition quarrel with itself by accusing one another of being Putin assets. That is something that the Putin regime is keen to systemically provoke and promote among the Russian opposition. And you see that in a very intensified form in that discourse. And an aim of the Putin regime is also to get us to argue about this. In Britain, the argument would look like Remainers accusing Brexiteers of being Russian assets, because a modicum of Russian interference can be perceived in the Brexit discourse and the Brexit process in the UK. What the Putin regime wants us Brits to do is take a 0.5% impact on our discourse and see it as a 50% discourse and gaslight our citizens who voted Brexit as being Russian assets, and for them to then fire back at us and for us to then fire back at them, and for polarization to deepen, for us to lose more trust, and then for us eventually to elect populist authoritarians of the kind that Boris Johnson was indeed, despite his support for Ukraine. So this is very, very problematic and very, very dangerous, because we're dealing with something ultimately real. The interference in our democracies is real, but our overreaction to that interference and our capacity to get into toxic quarrels with each other about it is intended to be an even more damaging facet of this interference than the interference itself. So what's the solution to this? The solution is to call some people Russian assets in cases where we can show enough receipts. But it is to be very conservative about simply reducing disagreements we have with each other by labeling one another Russian assets just because we disagree on some policy towards Russia. I mean, for instance, you look at the debate about a post-Putin Russia and the issue of Russia's disintegration. There's this question: could Russia break up? Will Russia break up? Should Russia break up? If Russia breaks up, what will they look? What would that look like? Would it look benign? Would it look catastrophic? And people who believe that Russia's breakup is likely and good are disagreeing with people who think that Russia's breakup is unlikely and bad, via invoking accusations of Putin message parroting, or indeed even being Putin assets. There are plenty of academics who say on Twitter that they have the view that Russia's breakup is unlikely, and even if it happened, it'd be a catastrophe for the region with multiple wars and civil wars and endless flows of refugees that would destabilize Ukraine of all countries and other East European states. Well, tell these people you're wrong. If you happen to have a theory of why Russia's breakup is likely and why Russia's breakup is more benign than some academic on Twitter says it is, make the case. But you can't call a Russian asset, for goodness sake, unless you can get out some receipts and show that they have some kind of compromised history or some kind of motivation beyond just what you perceive as intellectual error to make the point that they're making. So we've got to be very serious about not having this concept creep where our particular way of opposing Putin is the only right way, and other ways of opposing Putin are, in fact, forms of indulgence of Putin's messaging or Putin's propaganda. And so the key distinction when it comes to then applying this to our own political disputes that aren't about Putin, that could be about levels of taxation or healthcare policy, we've got to distinguish between organic domestic problems that we have and malign foreign interference, recognize that it's both, but then be realistic about what is what. Are we looking at a domestic conflict that is to a degree of 0.1% infused by malign foreign interference, or do we think it's 50? If it's 50, make the case that it's 50, but don't lazily claim that it's 50 when you can only substantiate 0.1%. That's the position that I advocate. And above all, what I want is for experts and academics not to do this kind of lazy wash, because it undermines academic expertise while academics advocate for Ukraine or advocate against authoritarian populists in domestic Western politics. And in undermining academic expertise via overstatement and lazy submersion of fellow citizens who oppose you into being in a category of Russian assets, that undermines academic expertise. And in undermining academic expertise, it undermines what the academy is in a democracy. And that is itself a very important counter-majoritarian institution, like the courts are, like parliaments are, like independent media is. So my advice to citizens is be cautious about being lazy about these distinctions, And my advice to academics is please slow down for goodness sake and be responsible. But it's hard because algorithms drive the desire for us to call each other Russian assets because we just get many, many more views. If I'm planning a video on why John Mearsheimer is wrong in applying a particular theory of international relations to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I could get a couple of 100,000 views for this video, but I would be in with a shot of getting 1 million views if I accused Mearsheimer of being a Russian asset.
Yeah.
I won't do that because my intellectual life is off YouTube in good part, and it makes it easy for me to resist algorithms and to resist the 24 extra cups of coffee that I would earn if I got a video to reach 1 million views. But it's very tempting for others to do it. And unfortunately, it's tempting for academics to do it. And it's tempting even for journalistic institutions to do it. I think there's a real danger because ultimately, what that excess of calling people not Russian assets is, it's a politics of enemies. You're effectively declaring that your political opponents are working for an enemy state that actually declares that it's at war with you. Because let me be clear, while I think Finland is fairly safe at the moment from Russian invasion, the Russians are talking about starting a nuclear war against us. Some representatives of the Russian state are constantly threatening to flood this island I am on with some kind of giant wave generated by a nuclear weapon. So these folks are my enemy. They're threatening to put me underwater. Now, that might not be a very serious threat, but they're threatening to put me underwater. For me to start categorizing my opponents in my own political system who voted Brexit together with people who want to put me underwater, I mean, that is an absolutely disastrous move unless I can really substantiate it. So that's the end of my rant on this.
Thank you so much for that, Ren, and thank you so much for this 1 hour, 15 minutes plus. It's been an absolutely wonderful time with you, Vlad Vexler. Thank you so much for joining the show.
It's such a pleasure, and I actually thought that your questions were exceptionally insightful and cutting.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Hope to talk to you later someday. Take care of yourself, and I'll be watching your videos for sure in the future as well.
Likewise.
Thank you, viewers and listeners. That was Futucast. We are going to make some more English language episodes in the future. Comment if you agree with that. And if you disagree with that, keep that to yourself. I don't care, because we will. Bye-bye. See you later.